Welcome. I am Dr. Mojtaba Moharrer, co-organizer of the Mobility Roundtable. I will be starting the roundtable and introducing the speakers. My co-organizer, Dr. Andrew Tomlinson from the University of Leeds in the UK, will guide the Q&A and close the session. Mobility and gender, use and abuse in design and operation of mobility. Globally, abuse has become a frequent experience of many mobility users. But what are the experiences the users go through? At what stage of design, planning, or operation should we intervene to make a difference? Is there a way to improve the existing system? In this roundtable, we'll discuss some of these questions and the role and impact of gender in use and abuse in mobility. We have three excellent speakers today. Professor Andree Woodcock, Chair of Educational Ergonomics and Design at the Institute of Creative Cultures at Coventry University in the UK, and Ms. ElsaMarie De Silva, founder and CEO of Safecity and the Red Dot Foundation in India, and Dr. Carol Mary Webster, sociocultural anthropologist specializing in gender, religion, race, ethnicity, based in the United States. So we are going to jump right in with our first speaker, Professor Andree Woodcock. Andree, please.
Yeah. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Right, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to this roundtable event. Right, so I work in Coventry. I lead on 2 EU projects. So that's European Union projects on Tingo and Suits. Both Tingo is specifically looking at intersectional approaches to collecting data and trying to get a paradigm shift in the way in which gender and diversity are tackled within planning of future transport systems. The WeMobile project is also relevant here because this was a project I conducted with Pakistan and Malaysia a little while ago, and that was looking at empathy for women and women's mobility needs in those two countries. And we did focus a lot on the lack of agency for women and the problems that women had in terms of use of transport in Pakistan and Malaysia. So I'm just going to quickly introduce my project to you, the one I'm working on at the moment. Ooh, and it's gone forward without me touching it. This is really good, isn't it? Why has it all gone wrong now? Okay, right. The project's been funded for 3 years by the EU, and what we want to do is create the means of effecting a long-term and sustainable change in transport, in particular smart mobility sector, so future transport, before it's too late. So we're seeing that there's a repetition of the same gender biases and the lack of inclusivity, the lack of diversity in what's happening in the next generation of transport. And we want to put a stop to that right now and say, no, we need more diversity in transport planning teams. We need more awareness of the needs of women and people from different ethnic groups, different minority groups. And this needs to be taken into account right at the start of planning future transport systems. So a lot of this is around gender and diversity mainstreaming. We know that gender and diversity mainstreaming work. They work in other sectors, but they've not had such a wide uptake in terms of transport. So you see that the transport planners are mostly male. There's a lack of diversity in the transport planning teams. The policymakers are all men, or a large proportion of them are men. And also the people who are employed in transport. We've only got 25% of women employed in transport across the EU. So there's no champion of women's issues. And if you look at diversity, that's even worse. We've made a few inroads in terms of gender, but diversity is still a problem. So unless you put right the transport ecosystem, you're actually not going to improve the lot of women because no one's championing it, no one's understanding what their needs are. So that's where we're coming from. And smart mobility really has an opportunity to actually move things forward. But at the moment, it's a lot of hype. It's a lot of technology push. without a wider vision of what inclusion is all about. So this is why we think there's a good opportunity here to make smart cities more equitable. So also in terms of from the academic community where I come from, there's lots of really interesting discourses around gender transport, poverty, intersectionality, women's agency. It's no good providing the best possible buses if women are denied mobility, control over their mobility, if they're not allowed out the house, or if it's so dangerous for them to go out the house, they just feel as if they're not wanted on the streets. And this happens as much in Europe, well, a little bit in Europe, but much more in other countries as well. And unless you solve that, just fixing transport may be the wrong place to start. We're also seeing that there's a real resistance, even across Europe, to there being a problem of gender and diversity. And we found this at national level when we work maybe with the, some of the East European countries, but also in terms of organisations. We approach them and say, would you like us to talk about gender and diversity and how you can widen gender and diversity in your workforce? And they say, we've not got a problem on that. We're not interested in that. So that's a real problem. And what I'm seeing is the same problems occurring against different parts of the transport sector. And this means that there's a systemic problem here. We're getting gender pay gaps, we're getting discriminatory work practices, and a lack of workplace diversity. Unless you embed that diversity within an organisation, they're never actually going to understand what the needs of women are. And if you have these diverse teams, you're also more effective as an organisation. A key issue is about the lack of gender disaggregated data, and this is an ongoing problem. There's not much gender disaggregated data being collected. It's really hard to actually compare that as well. And without that, we don't have an evidence base of what's going on. So we're going to achieve all this within my project by looking at different approaches to collect data, having this cross-sectoral vision that I'm trying to build up, and mechanisms to create awareness of lack of gender and diversity. So we're going to give people tools and methods where they can actually look at gender and diversity action planning within their organisations and maybe make a compelling argument for all this. To help us on this, we've developed a Transport Innovation Gender Observatory, which is a one-stop shop to collate all this information, and an open gender repository to look at the data. Did I see something flash up then? I did, okay. That's my project's distribution. This is the organisational structure of it. So I'm working across Europe with 10 hubs who are all busy engaging in citizen science and engagement that can be beacons of engagement, activity and know-how so that the organisations can come to them, and also looking at data collection. And I think maybe that's it in terms of what I'm doing. Also, this is about design. So how can we start using design as a way to talk to people about the wider issue, the deeper issues that they have facing transport? Just stopping them talking and maybe just putting a pen in their hand, they can start to communicate in different ways. And we're exploring the ways in which that can happen as well, but with an emphasis on making transport more safe and secure for women. Yeah, that's me. That's my website. And that's it, I think. I'm sorry about that. Sorry it's a bit confusing. And I hope you get some of what I was trying to say anyway. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Perfect. Very good. We have good material for the Q&A and the discussion afterwards. So our next speaker is Dr. Carol-Marie Webster, sociocultural anthropologist. And Carol-Marie, all yours. Sorry, I have to ask you to unmute.
Hi. I think you have my PowerPoint. If you can bring up the first and then the second slide. Yes. No?
So 1 second. I keep forgetting that my computer is probably the slowest in there.
So I'll start talking and it'll come up when it's ready. My work is primarily around human beings and the way in which they encounter each other and space. I'm concerned here in transport about, I think it's coming. I'm concerned here when it comes to transport and mobility around, first slide, the next slide, please. The way in which, ooh, something is in the back, don't worry. The way in which transportation makes one feels. This is the iconic picture of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, as many of you already know, was a central civil rights figure. She spearheaded the Montgomery bus boycotts. And in her 2011 interview, she stated, "I have always had trouble with the bus drivers." So she enters her conversation about her iconic role in history by stating a day-to-day fact. Every day, she had trouble with the bus drivers. And so every day, she had to adjust herself, deal with the affective space of having to go to battle to be able to travel through and do her daily chores, go to work, take care of her children, take care of her husband, do those essential things. And imagine so many years after having made history, we celebrated her 108th birthday on February 4th, 2021. And still today, next slide, please. Next slide, please. And still today, people are impacted by the sense of the mode of travel. Sarah Ahmed and Teresa Brennan, he talks about the role of affect and the creation of affect in spaces. Ahmed says, affect is something that's out there that gets and sticks to you. So the kind of emotional and psychosocial affect that is distributed through the space impacts the individual as they travel. Yes? Teresa Brennan takes another turn. She says that affects gets in you. So it's in you and it becomes a part of your embodiment. Now we have learned, especially over these last years, with the role of neuroscience and the work of genetics, that ongoing racial and ethnic and gendered abuse and violence actually has impact on the organ systems of individuals, so that individuals end up with more prevalence of high blood pressure, of diabetes, of chronic heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. And so in creating space, I'm concerned about the ways in which we are making choices about people's lifespan and the value of people's lives by the way we construct transportation modalities. I'm specifically talking about in this presentation the bus and the bus space. It's one of the spaces that is most used by women around the world, and women around the world make up the majority of those who are taking public transportation. So the impact on women means that there is an impact on families. Everyone is impacted once you have impacted a woman. Next slide, please. there's no doubt between the last slide and this current slide that there's a difference in economic situation of the country that is being lived in. But I want you to take notice that there is a very clear similarity in the emotional sense of the individuals involved. Yes? So what are we saying when we cannot create safe spaces, safe emotional spaces, void of abuse, while people are making what I call temporal communities as they travel? A temporal community is a space in which you are a community by virtue of occupying a space and being impacted by that space simultaneously. So when you go to the theater, you participate in a temporal community. You ascend to a particular kind of journey, and everyone is traveling the journey. Not everyone is traveling the journey equally, but everyone is traveling the journey and can agree about some basic objective things within the environment of that journey. Yes? So I am concerned about the affective space, that we, thank you, that we layer the socioeconomic and the social divides that exists within a society. We layer those on very densely into the mobility spaces. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Again, in this densely crowded space, all of the photos that you've seen so far, all of the slides are from COVID times. And you see that in addition to the stress of not being able to do social distancing, you also have the stress of the socioeconomic and political discourses that exist within the environment, because unfortunately in most places, COVID care has been politicized. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Yes, we have a lot to talk about in the Q&A. It was a very great talk. So we move to our third and final speaker, Elsa. Going to, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Good evening from Mumbai. And those were two very powerful presentations, but it'll kind of explain where I'm coming from. So, you know, when I was 13, I had this horrific incident where I was groped on a train, and little did I realize that it would affect how I chose my means of transport. I forever after that have been scarred, and I don't like traveling by train in Mumbai. And for the longest time, I would never opt for it. And, you know, today we are talking about sustainable cities, about mass transit, and I very happily would, you know, use my car and drive in a city like Bombay, which is highly dense and congested. But I would be happy sitting in my car for 3 hours, but I just wouldn't get myself to take the train. And I started on this journey with my work with Safecity and Red Dot Foundation about 9 years ago, after a horrific gang rape of a young woman on a bus in Delhi. She was so badly injured that she died of her injuries. But since then, I've been, you know, working on this topic. And what I realize is that there's a very poor understanding of what actually constitutes sexual violence, abuse, harassment. It's a spectrum, you know, that ranges from non-verbal forms of it, that is staring, ogling, taking pictures, indecent gestures, etc. Verbal, commenting, catcalls, sexual invites, and then the physical, touching, groping, stalking, sexual assault, rape, And now some of these also transcend into the virtual world. But what's happening is that it has been normalized and it's part of our daily routine that we tend to ignore it. We tend to tell ourselves, just grin and deal with it. And most often we don't report it. And because we don't report it, what's happening is there is a data gap that exists. We are trying to bridge that data gap and trying to encourage the reporting of these underreported crimes. So what we do at Safecity is we encourage people to anonymously document their experience, and then it's collated as these location-based trends, which you can see all these bubbles that are there with numbers in it are actually stories. And you can zoom in right up to the street level and check out what's happening. And the idea is to visualize these stories because they give you a sense of what's happening, where it's happening, the day of week, the time of day. And these insights help you to figure out what you want to do at an individual level or a community level, or maybe an institutional level. So for example, as an individual, if I had prior information of what I might experience based on other people's experiences, I would be better prepared. Today, often when I'm suddenly, sexually harassed, I freeze. And then I beat myself up later emotionally because that was not the appropriate response. But with this kind of data, I can make better choices. I can respond more quickly, but I can also engage my communities to help me find a better solution, start the dialogue with them, because this is a taboo topic that is often never spoken about. And we can also demand accountability from service providers. And I'll explain. So whilst we don't really work on individual stories, we did a photo campaign which talks about, these young people or different kinds of people experiencing the city and transport in different ways. This girl or this woman was with her 14-year-old sister, and she was abused on the platform. And when she raised her voice, which is often very rare that somebody raises their voice, people turned around and said, "What were you doing at the wrong place at the wrong time?" And this woman, she's not young, but even she was verbally harassed at the train station. This is another young girl who says it's common, why complain? And there's low trust with the police, right? So these are two teachers, and they're talking about the anonymity in crowded spaces that allow perpetrators to touch you. And this is another woman who said staring and touching in buses is common. Now, our data set has been used in many different ways. We did a whole study on women's responses in buses. 50% of women did not respond at all. And those that responded, they did not get any support from bystanders. So in 50% of the cases when people responded or spoke up, only 50% of the bystanders intervened, which means we need to do a lot of work with even bystanders to help them understand the problem and what could be the most appropriate responses. In Kathmandu, they proved through our data set that there is a need for women-only buses. Now, whilst I don't particularly agree with segregated transportation, without it, I don't think I could travel on a train in Bombay, for example. We have ladies' coaches, but that should be part of the solution. The larger picture is, okay, what happens when you get out of a ladies' coach or a bus that is meant only for women? Are you still safe or not? And how do we change that attitude towards women's presence? Because it's really impacting how women are seen in public spaces. People, like the first presenter said, the planners don't even take women's experiences into account. So for example, a lot of women are dropping out of the labor workforce in India. Today, we are at our lowest, below 24%. And yet, a McKinsey study says if there was true gender equality and we increase the number of women in the workforce, it would add $770 billion to our GDP. So it's a good thing. So why aren't we taking into account? And that really makes us reflect as to whether we are really seen as equal to our peers. There's another study that used Safecity data, which proved that women spend more on transport, about $300 per year for safer transport options. And in our part of the world, that's somebody's monthly salary. But it also proved that women opt for the nearest university or college, which may not be the best one. So they compromise on their education. And we see that often, that because it's not safe, under the guise of safety, their family restricts their mobility, and they also self-restrict their own movements, their opportunities, and their quality of life. I'm going to stop there because there's so much to talk about.
That was great, thank you. 3 excellent talks. I invite Andrea to turn on her camera so we can have the Q&A discussions. Before I hand over to Andrew for the Q&A, if any of the speakers would like to ask the other 2 any questions, or they want to share their thoughts about their talk, please, I invite you to go ahead. Elsa, Andrea, ElsaMarie. ElsaMarie, you're muted if you're trying to talk. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a comment on the last speaker. When we've done our work in Pakistan, we've found exactly the same thing. So women spend more money on safer forms of transport because they have to. So it's a forced choice. Also because they are denied access to things like bikes and motorbikes. Their journeys are much more complicated and longer than the men. So this is really reducing their opportunities and their life chances as well. Also, there's the effect of the dual burden of women, and I think you touched on this. So it's not just the woman taking longer to actually travel, and she's harassed when she travels, it's the fact that she's actually got to do a full-time job when she gets home as well, which is a real burden. So we are so stressing the women by not having proper transport for them.
So before Elsa and ElsaMarie respond, we already had a couple of good questions. Please, if you have any questions, the audience, please write them in chat area and Andrew will get to them. ElsaMarie, Elsa, if you like, please go ahead.
Actually, I had one picture which I didn't show, which was on a transgender. So the question by Juliet is that we are talking about binary. Yes, I agree. You know, in our transport system, there is no space for other genders. And it's very difficult. Also, when you talk about public spaces, there's toilets. We don't even have, we just have ladies and gents, you know. And even on our trains, for example, we call it general and ladies. But because there's a dedicated ladies compartment, when a woman enters a general compartment, it's a free for all because it's an invitation to touch her body. Why is she here? She should be in the ladies compartment, you know? So yes, we have a long way to go and we have a lot of work ahead of us, but yeah, these are just some of the points that I wanted to bring forward in this discussion to spark this thought that we need more diversity in the planning, in the designing stages, because we are not capturing people's lived realities.
I am wondering if it is an issue of planning and designing, not to say that planning and designing isn't an issue. But before planning and designing, it appears to me that there is an adherence to some type of philosophy that says, okay, this is how it's going to be done. And regardless of whether or not this has negative impact on the GDP, regardless of whether or not this has negative impact on families' health and well-being, there is a buy-in into a gender hierarchy that is more important than how much the country makes overall. It's more important than whether or not everyone is healthy in the family. It's more important so that when Professor goes is sitting in the, Andree Woodcock is sitting in the meetings and asking businesses, oh, let us have a conversation about gender inequity, et cetera, there isn't a problem, because there isn't a problem based on where the buy-in is. Yes? So I often think that we attempt to tackle this issue of equity and diversity from the lens of economy, as if economy is the ultimate driver. And it isn't. If it were, many of these problems would have been solved a long time ago. Economy is not the ultimate driver. That's my thought.
You're absolutely right. It's patriarchy and the preference for male over female. And that's reflected in India's atrocious sex ratio. So
Yeah.
it is a deeper problem. And this is just the manifestation of it.
Yes. And we have to be also careful because patriarchy is an institution that serves some people above others. But I want to be clear that patriarchy does not only service men, it services women who are at a particular rung in the society. And so as we unpack what patriarchy does in the various settings, in developed and developing worlds, or whatever the new terms are, yes, we need to nuance the lenses to be able to fully see what the critical break is. What's the thing that's linking it together? Yeah, so that's what I'm thinking about all of that.
Andree, to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh,
Andrea.
yeah. Oh.
No.
Sorry, yeah, carry on, Andree. Yeah.
That's fine. No, you carry on with this.
Sorry, I just no, please. I just jumped in there.
Yeah, when my student was doing her study in Pakistan, and she was trying to talk to the some of the transport stakeholders, gender was so not on their radar. She couldn't even get them to contemplate. Women just didn't count. She was lucky that she'd even had a conversation with them and had the temerity to even try and ask something about that. It's a completely different mindset, and yet we are very much without value. And that is reflected, I think, more now. I think there's increasing problems around this, especially in Pakistan. The situation was getting worse. And if women are just seen as not of value, and they shouldn't actually be even on the street. And so anything can happen to them. They don't report crimes because then their families worry, and then any mobility they have will be taken away from them even more. So they just become more and more imprisoned.
Okay, thank you, Andree.
Can I just say one small other thing? The WeMobile project was about trying to develop empathy, and we hear a lot of these really powerful stories, but is there an increase in empathy by anyone who's listening to these stories?
Who's listening to the stories? And what are they doing with the stories when they listen to them? Yeah. It's whether it's in Europe or in the United States, in Pakistan or in Jamaica, where I'm from, these conversations with different classes of people create additional burden on women to bring them to both women and men to say, okay, how can we change this? ElsaMarie, when you say that a woman speaking out against her abuser on a train platform only brings some small percent of response. Yes, that's an important thing, the way in which people play into whatever the system is because they want to feel safe, right? That they want to feel safe, and what is not safe is to respond in a let me help you way.
Okay, so we have a question from me. So I think we've got a question from Mina about data, and then I'd like to ask a question about data as well. So Mina would like to know from Andree, how can we overcome the imbalance of data with respect to the gender effect research? For example, it is scientific that motion sickness affects more women than men. However, when we search databases, the probability is that data is showing an imbalanced proportion of gender with the prevalence for the male category. Thus, how do we overcome this imbalance in the data?
Yeah, well, good question. We have been trying to look at discourses in academic scripts to see if there's been any systematic bias. We didn't see any in terms of the actual way in which things would be, any gender bias in the way in which the articles were constructed, but definitely there is a gender bias in the data that itself is being collected. And I think it's a training issue, and it's also up to the research managers to actually ensure that there is gendered data being collected. Taking an example from smart mobility at the moment, we've been involved in with some organisations who are running trials, and they're still not collecting data, gender desegregated data or any socio-demographic data on who's using new forms of transport. It's still not there. And I think it is a training issue, and the research managers ought to be addressing this and ensuring that everybody knows how to collect it as a starting point, and that it should be collected, because obviously that they're not seeing that this is an issue at the moment. So I would look at the training and also the funding of research as well to make sure that every bit of research is collecting socio-demographic data, gendered data, and diversity data. We've got not a large pool to work with.
Thank you. That's very wise. Can I just ask ElsaMarie a question about the Red Dot campaign and the data that you have? I mean, that was particularly powerful for me, seeing the data presented in that way and being able to, as you say, zoom in to the street level. But is this data, I mean, this data can be used in a number of different ways. I think you intimated that perhaps it could be used by women who want to travel so that they become aware of the risks. But can it also be used as a means of kind of shaming neighborhoods into taking some action? Does it have a campaigning role as well as a kind of informing role? Maybe you can comment on how your tool's been used within society.
So the way we work with partner nonprofits or residential associations, and they encourage their members to report, and then they look at the data and then they decide how they want to use it. So for example, not always it's the police that is the stakeholder that they're going to engage with. It could be amongst themselves that they decide what is it that needs to be done. So for example, in this one suburb in Bombay, it was not a low-income neighborhood. They decided to train themselves on self-defense. They also train their watchmen. Now the watchmen are, Bombay has a lot of apartment complexes. The position of the watchman or the security guard is the first position somebody who comes from the village to the city takes up. He's not really trained in that position. And so he's not really going to intervene when a crime is occurring because he doesn't know how. So they decided to train their security guards, but also gave them whistles. They had a whistle protocol, which was endorsed by the police, and a bunch of other measures, including being more aware of what are their rights, what are the different laws, etc. And it gave the residents a lot of confidence, especially a lot of them were senior citizens. So it brought them closer. They're still a very close-knit community. They had a communication protocol. They also engaged with the police better, so they started working with the police. So it's really that community who decides how they want to use that data set. And we've used it in low-income communities as well, where they invited the police for a discussion. These are women who are illiterate, and you wouldn't associate them with a data set, but they were able to put their demands forward and the police couldn't dispute it because that is evidence, right? In fact, they changed their beat patrol. So I feel that it's also how you use this data, and if the community uses it in ways that are preventive, it actually builds trust. It is in the open source domain, so others can use it. A lot of researchers use it as well. And with, you could, one doesn't know how others will use the data in a negative way, but we've seen that it's also being used in a very positive way. So that's what I will say. The other thing that I would say is that as individuals, how do we use it? We live in a world where we depend a lot on peer reviews. So I have TripAdvisor, I have Goodreads, I have Yelp, and so many others. And I'm constantly looking at ratings, right? Whilst we are not rating a space, I, as an individual, when I'm selecting a hotel to stay at outside of my known areas, I do depend on what people put in the comments section. And I pay attention to what people are saying. So I can build my situational awareness if I had access to information. India, we don't have open data. If I wanted access to crime data, I would have to make what is known as a right to information application in every police station, which is an impossible task. What the National Crime Research Bureau publishes is very high level, X number of rapes in a city. I can't do much with that data, right? So I think access to information is critical. The disaggregated level of information is important, and teaching community how to use that data is also important.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask a quick question, Andrew? Very quick from Elsa. Sorry. How do they report the incident? On the spot when it happens, they report it and use the GPS data, or do they report it later?
No. So I don't believe that our app is an SOS app or in the moment. I think that when you are experiencing something, you should take care of your own safety. The last thing you're going to think about is my app. It is when you have been able to process the incident and you feel like you want to document it, you document it. Most women I know, or most people I know, are not going to go to a police station to report commenting or staring, for example. That's the kind of crime that we have on our, commenting, staring, touching, groping, masturbation, all those kind of things. And how do you deal with it? All of this is a crime under Indian law. We don't believe that everybody needs to be put in jail for it, but we definitely need people to be challenged about their behavior. We need them to be educated about their behavior being, offensive to others. And we need community to have each other's back. And we've used art murals at key locations where it's happening, street theater to educate, because we're talking about a society where women or girls don't feel comfortable saying it out loud. We call the wall murals stalking walls, for example. And not everybody also has access to technology. So it doesn't matter if you don't have access to a phone. In some places we put boxes, we call them talking boxes. The idea is borrowed by from my friend Jane in Kibera, Kenya. We helped her digitize her data, and digitizing your data allows you to see the clusters and then decide, okay, who do we want to call in the room to solve the problem? So for example, Kibera is a huge slum in Nairobi. Google Maps doesn't even work over there. But being able to cluster the data, she was able to pinpoint locations and then bring in religious leaders to talk to the men and boys. When they see the data and the storytelling, they can then preach in their sermons and talk to the young men to say that's not appropriately how you would behave.
Thank you. Can we move on? So Peter and Robin both kind of suggested something that I was thinking about as well, which is public transport systems are designed to move a lot of people in a particular direction. That's normally how you imagine a public transport system when we're not in COVID, that it's going to be quite busy, crowded. You're trying to move a lot of people, get them to work or get them home. And necessarily space is going to be very constrained. Yeah. So that creates an environment where this type of behavior the perpetrator can get away with it, basically, I imagine. So given the nature of public transport, what kinds of mitigations or what kinds of approach do you think, the panel, that you can use to make it a safer and a more acceptable environment for women and people of diversity to travel on? Obviously, you mentioned women-only transport as one method, but are there other approaches as well? Maybe Andree, you could speak first, because I noticed in your little piece you had some designs for seats that looked like shells.
We are sort of thinking about design issues. So yeah, seats where people say, oh, they don't want to be disturbed, but I'm not sure if that's the right way around this. So design can come a long way. You can sort of look at aromatherapy. You can look at sounds as well to try and sort of create a nicer ambience maybe, or go down the zero harassment route, which is very difficult to enforce. Also, there's the training route as well. No, it's a citizenship issue. It's not tolerable that this is happening. The other issue would be to empower the drivers a bit more and have more people who are actually patrolling what's going on, and they shouldn't be afraid to intervene. And at the moment, I think it's, a driver is afraid to intervene, or a conductor is afraid of intervening because they'll make the situation worse, or they will be attacked. So I think a lot of it is around education. Design can go a long way, but you need an attitude shift in this, that it's just not acceptable. And that's a long term, maybe decades away, I think, shifting this.
Yes, yeah. So maybe Carol Marie, what's your opinion of having women-only transport? Is that a potential solution, do you think, or a mitigation?
I think that it is a limited solution. For those people who are somehow empowered by the jeering at women, et cetera, the women's only transport will end up being, I believe, targeted as a space. As soon as the women are getting on and off, they know that that's the transport for women. And so it sort of gives them a nice place to do their thing. Andree mentioned something about having people do a particular type of policing. At least that's what came to my mind as she said it. So maybe individuals who are dressed as normal individuals, but actually have the power to intervene. So they're going through the buses and the trains, and especially when they're filled with people, and somehow have some kind of training to intervene. That would help. Certainly, these are societal issues. These are issues around power. These are issues around place and space. So how to retrain a whole citizenry, yes, to understand what is acceptable and what's not, and to have really punitive interventions, yes? Mm-hmm. So if someone is caught, it's a small thing, you've touched someone and you think it's small, but this actually has a huge impact on society. And so you will have to pay this amount or do this length of community service. I'm not in for jails, but there should be something that the person have to do that shames them really into responding correctly. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, ElsaMarie, you said that you weren't a fan of women-only transport, presumably for the reasons which have been outlined. But I guess it's one solution which enables women to travel when they otherwise wouldn't be able to.
I wouldn't be able to travel, honestly, on the local train in Mumbai if it weren't for the ladies' compartment. But I do believe that there is no effort being made to educate people that women also deserve to be in the same space, and their personal space should be respected. To give you an example, the Mumbai Metro recently was inaugurated some few years ago. It's this air-conditioned coach, etc. And they didn't have a ladies' compartment. Within a week, they were forced to introduce the ladies' compartment because people just didn't respect the personal space of the women on board. But I feel even if you do have it, it's a convenience right now. But what about the common areas? What about the ticketing counter? What about the platform? What about the exit and entry points? What about the overfoot bridges? One of those photographs was immediately outside. What about the auto stand, the cab line, whatever? You are standing with men. So they need to get used to your presence. So I think there has to be a larger campaign. And I have been to very crowded cities, or rather cities where the transport is crowded. Take Bangkok, for example, or New York, the subway, or even London. I don't see, yes, it's crowded and maybe there are incidents happening, but it's not alien to have women in your space. So we shouldn't create a culture where it's alien for women to be in your space. And that's what we are doing in India.
Thank you. That's very good. So there's been lots of really good comments in the chat about good examples. So we've had women-only teams at metro stations in Mumbai, which I think is which is good. So can anybody give any examples of transport operators who are more attuned to these issues? Are all transport operators the same, or are some transport operators trying to address these issues?
Sometimes they are for photo ops. So sometimes it's to tick those boxes. But I do find that and it's not so often in India, but when an Uber driver is a woman and you have booked the Uber late at night or very early in the morning, it's very comforting in my view to be driven by a woman. It just brings that stress level down, especially if you're in a strange city. Not that that woman can't commit a crime, but you assume that, you know, it's safer, which kind of points to that, right? Like, how many women could be cab drivers? In my country, there's now this shift in thinking. About 2 or 3 years back, it wasn't a profession that was acceptable to a woman. And even if people were willing to train them to be drivers, women weren't picking up that profession simply because they weren't allowed by their families to drive late at night. They had children to care for, etc., etc. So these are small baby steps, but if you do it in different ways, have many more women station managers, more women, you know, transport operators, planners, and you start seeing women at odd hours of the day and night in public spaces, taking public transport, all of it adds up at the end of the day to create that perception of safety and the feeling that, yes, I can also be out. You know, we have this group in Bombay, Why Loiter, where they encourage women to go and just loiter in a park or take public transport late at night by yourself, not with a group of friends. And the idea is to overcome your own anxiety that you can be in that space.
Mm. So that it sounds really similar to the kind of debates we have around cycling, in that the best way to make cycling safer is to encourage more people to do it. Because when more people do it, then it kind of normalizes the behavior and people. So that's kind of what you're saying then. If more women travel, then it makes women's presence in the transport system safer.
Can I chime in just hopefully just for half a second?
Carol Mary, I just say that it's 1 o'clock. I thank everyone. Thank you, Juliet. Let us know. Leave. Please, I don't want to, I must apologize I interrupted you. Please continue. Whoever wants to leave, please feel free. We will share the recording, but it's such an engaging conversation. If it's okay with everybody, I would like to continue for another few minutes. Carol Mary, please continue. I apologize.
So I like that you have spoken about galvanizing women's presence in the space. I partly grew up in New York, and one of the things that New York City has is this vibrancy of lots of people in the space. But I want us to be clear, why maybe not at the same level as to what's happening in India, this issue of women's violations on public transportation is pretty pervasive throughout the developed and developing world. Myself at 16 was groped, and I was fortunate enough that I had some training prior, I don't know why, and I dug my nails into the hand and lifted it and asked, whose hand is this? But then the door opened on the train and the person ran out. But there is a way to empower, to at least grab hold of your own power. Recently, in Brooklyn, New York, there had been a trail of women who had been abused after midnight as they got out of the train station. The police failed to alert people that this was going on. And so I think it came up to something like 15 women over the course of something like six months. Just query it, it's online somewhere. Yes, so there is a pervasiveness. So we have to talk about what is citizenship and what is citizenry and how it is people think about that. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you. I think as Mojtaba said, I think we're going to have to wrap it up now. So I just wondered if any of our panelists have final comments they'd like to make in the light of the discussion. It's been a fantastic session. If any of the three of you would like to just make a concluding remark, now is the time to do that. So, okay. So, well, thank you very much, Andree, ElsaMarie, and Carol Marie. I feel it's been a fantastic roundtable, as they always are. We've had a really interesting discussion. I feel I've been in the room with grown-ups today. It's really nice, and it's certainly educated me in terms of something that I hadn't necessarily appreciated was such a significant issue. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for 3 really good presentations as well, with different views on the topic. Just to say before we finish that, as we know, these roundtables are monthly, the 3rd Thursday of the month. So the next one is going to be a slight change from this month. It's going to be on mobility and energy, and that will be on the 18th of March. At 5 o'clock in the UK, 12 o'clock Eastern time in the US, and 10:30, 22:30 in Mumbai, for any of our audience who are joining from there. So it just remains from me and from Mujtaba to say thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the audience for joining today. It's been a really good discussion, and I hope everybody stay safe and have a good day or evening, depending upon where you are. Thank you.